The Wyoming Territory, December 1887. The blizzard came without warning, as they often did in these parts. One moment the sky showed patches of pale blue between the clouds, and the next, a wall of white fury descended upon the land like the wrath of an angry god. Thomas Garrett pulled his collar higher against the biting wind, squinting through the swirling snow that stung his face like 1,000 tiny needles. At 24, Thomas was what folks in town called a greenhorn young, inexperienced and foolishly optimistic about making his fortune in the harsh Wyoming Territory. He'd inherited 300 acres from an uncle he'd never met, along with a modest herd of cattle and a cabin that leaked in 3 places when it rained. For 2 years now, he'd worked the land alone, his only companion a bay mare named Belle who understood his moods better than most people ever had. "Easy, girl," he murmured, patting Belle's neck as she stumbled through a drift. The snow was already up to her knees, and Thomas knew they were in serious trouble. They'd been checking the eastern pasture when the storm hit, and now turned around in the white chaos. He had no idea which direction led home. His fingers had long since gone numb inside his leather gloves. Ice crystals formed on his eyebrows and the stubble on his jaw. Every breath burned his lungs, and Belle's labored breathing told him she was struggling too. The temperature was dropping fast. He could feel it through his wool coat and the 2 shirts beneath. If they didn't find shelter soon, they'd both be frozen corpses by morning. Just 2 more casualties of the unforgiving frontier. Thomas had heard the stories. Of course, cowboys found in the spring thaw, perfectly preserved, still sitting upright on their horses. The thought made him shudder, though whether from cold or fear, he couldn't tell. His father had warned him about coming west, had called it a fool's errand for a boy who'd grown up in the relative comfort of Missouri farmland. But both his parents were gone now, taken by the fever 3 winters past, and there'd been nothing left for him back home but memories and debt. Through the howling wind, Thomas thought he saw something, a flicker of orange light in the wall of white. He blinked hard, ice crystals falling from his lashes. There it was again, faint but unmistakable. Fire meant people, and people meant survival. "Come on, Belle," he urged, turning the mare toward the light. She resisted at first, her instincts telling her to turn tail to the wind, but Thomas insisted, step by agonizing step. They pushed through the deepening snow, that small beacon of warmth drawing them forward like moths to a flame. As they drew closer, Thomas could make out a shape through the storm, a cone of buffalo hide stretched over wooden poles, a teepee. His heart sank even as relief flooded through him. Indians. His father's voice echoed in his memory, full of warnings about the red devils who'd scalp a white man soon as look at him. But another voice, quieter and more insistent, reminded him that death by freezing was certain, while death by Indian was only possible. Belle stumbled again, nearly going to her knees, and Thomas made his decision. Pride and prejudice were luxuries he couldn't afford in a blizzard. He slid from the saddle, his legs nearly buckling as they hit the ground, leading Belle by the reins. He approached the teepee. The entrance flap was secured against the storm, but he could see firelight glowing through the hide walls and smell smoke from the peak. With numb fingers, he rapped on the wooden frame beside the entrance. "Hello," his voice came out as a croak, his throat raw from the cold. "Please, I need help." For a long moment, there was only the howl of the wind. Then the flap lifted, and Thomas found himself looking at a young woman's face, illuminated by the firelight behind her. She had high cheekbones, dark eyes that studied him warily, and long black hair braided down one shoulder. She couldn't have been more than 20. She said something in a language he didn't understand, then switched to English. "White man, you are lost." "My horse and we're freezing. Please." His teeth were chattering so hard he could barely get the words out. The woman's eyes moved from his face to Belle, who stood with her head low, sides heaving. Something in her expression softened. She turned and spoke rapidly in her own language to someone inside the teepee. Another woman's voice answered, older, more authoritative. "Bring horse around back," the young woman said. "There is shelter. Then you come inside." Thomas nearly wept with relief. He led Belle around the teepee to a lean-to he hadn't noticed before, constructed of poles and brush. 2 Indian ponies stood inside, and they nickered softly as Belle joined them. He loosened her saddle but was too weak to lift it off. When he returned to the entrance, the flap was open, the young woman beckoning him inside. He had to duck low to enter, and immediately the warmth hit him like a physical blow. For a moment, he stood swaying, blinking in the smoky interior. "Sit," the young woman commanded, pointing to a buffalo robe near the fire. "You are ice." Thomas collapsed more than sat, his frozen joints protesting. Now he could see there were 2 women in the teepee, the one who'd answered the door and another, perhaps a few years older, who was heating something in a pot over the fire. Both wore doeskin dresses decorated with beadwork, and their faces, while wary, weren't unkind. I'm Thomas," he managed through chattering teeth. "Thomas Garrett. I have a ranch about—" He gestured vaguely, having no idea anymore which direction was which. Somewhere. The younger woman almost smiled. "I am Mary," she said. "This is my sister, Sarah." She spoke to her sister in their language, and Sarah nodded, ladling something from the pot into a wooden cup. "Drink," Sarah said, her English more accented than Mary's. She handed him the cup, and Thomas wrapped both hands around it, feeling the heat seep into his frozen fingers. The liquid was some kind of tea, bitter but warming, and he drank it gratefully. "Thank you," he said, meaning it with every fiber of his being. "I thought I was going to die out there." "Storm does not care if man is white or Apache," Mary said, settling across the fire from him. "Cold kills all the same." Apache. Thomas had heard stories about them too, fierce warriors who'd fought the army for decades. But these 2 women, quietly going about the business of saving his life, didn't match any of the tales he'd heard. Sarah moved behind him, and before Thomas could protest, she was pulling his frozen coat from his shoulders. "Too wet," she said simply. "Must dry." He was too exhausted to argue, too grateful for the warmth to care about propriety. She hung his coat on a wooden frame near the fire, then draped a blanket around his shoulders. It smelled of smoke and sage, but it was dry and warm, and Thomas pulled it close. "You live alone?" Mary asked, studying him with those dark, intelligent eyes. Thomas nodded. "Have done for 2 years now. Got a place east of here, or west, I don't rightly know anymore. No wife, no family." He shook his head, suddenly aware of how young and inexperienced he must seem to these women who clearly knew how to survive in this harsh land. "Never had a wife. Never—" He paused, embarrassed. "Never even been to a saloon hall, if you know what I mean. My PA raised me strict before he died." Mary translated for her sister, and Sarah made a sound that might have been amusement. She said something in Apache that made Mary's eyes widen slightly. "What did she say?" Thomas asked. Mary hesitated, then translated. "She says you are like new snow, untouched, but snow does not stay new for long out here." Sarah added something else, her tone softer now. "She says you will learn," Mary continued, "if you survive." Thomas nodded, understanding the truth in those words. The frontier had a way of teaching hard lessons fast. He'd already learned plenty about loneliness, about the weight of responsibility, about how quickly nature could turn from beautiful to deadly. But sitting here in this teepee, surrounded by warmth and unexpected kindness, he realized there was still much he didn't know. Outside, the storm raged on, wind howling like a living thing. The teepee swayed slightly but held firm, its design perfected over generations to withstand nature's fury. Thomas found himself drowsing despite his best efforts to stay awake, the warmth and the strange tea combining to pull him towards sleep. "Rest," Mary said. "Storm will blow all night. In morning, we will help you find your way." "I can't impose," Thomas mumbled, though he couldn't imagine going back out into that white hell. "You will die if you leave now," Sarah said bluntly. "Dead white man outside our lodge brings trouble. Better you live." It was practical reasoning, but Thomas sensed something more, a basic human kindness that transcended the divisions between their peoples. As his eyes grew heavy, he watched the two sisters moving about their home with quiet efficiency. Mary added wood to the fire while Sarah prepared sleeping arrangements, laying out buffalo robes and blankets. Just before sleep took him, Thomas had a strange thought. He'd left his cabin that morning as one man, isolated, self-reliant, shaped by the prejudices and assumptions of his upbringing. But something about this night, this storm, these two Apache women who'd taken in a stranger, something was changing inside him. He could feel it, subtle as the shift of seasons, inevitable as the sunrise that would follow this brutal night. The last thing he heard before darkness claimed him was Mary's voice, soft and melodic, singing something in Apache. It might have been a lullaby, or a prayer, or simply a song to pass the time while the storm raged. But to Thomas, warm for the first time in hours and safe from the killing cold, it sounded like grace itself. Thomas woke to silence and pale light filtering through the teepee walls. For a moment, he couldn't remember where he was. Then the events of the night came rushing back, the blizzard, the desperate search for shelter, the two Apache women who'd saved his life. He sat up slowly, muscles stiff from cold and exhaustion. The fire had burned low, just glowing embers now, but the teepee retained its warmth. Mary sat near the entrance, working on something with beads and leather. She looked up as he stirred. "The storm has passed," she said. "Sarah is seeing to your horse." Thomas rubbed his face, feeling the stubble rough against his palm. "She's all right, Belle." "She lives." "My sister knows horses." Mary set aside her beadwork and moved to the fire, stirring the embers back to life. "Are you hungry?" His stomach answered for him with a loud growl, and Mary's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. She ladled something from a pot into a wooden bowl, a stew that smelled of herbs and meat. Thomas accepted it gratefully, the first spoonful warming him from the inside out. "This is good," he said, meaning it. "What's in it?" "Rabbit, wild onions, things that grow here." Mary watched him eat with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You white men, always asking what instead of just accepting." Thomas paused, spoon halfway to his mouth. "I didn't mean any offense." "No offense taken. It is just different." She returned to her beadwork, fingers moving with practiced skill. "My people learn to accept what is given, to be grateful without questions." The tent flap lifted, and Sarah entered, bringing with her a blast of cold air and the brilliant glare of sun on snow. She said something to Mary in Apache, then nodded at Thomas. "Your horse is strong," she told him in her careful English. "She will carry you home." Thomas stood, still wrapped in the borrowed blanket. Through the open flap, he could see a world transformed. The storm had left everything buried under a thick blanket of white, sparkling in the morning sun like scattered diamonds. It was beautiful and terrible at once. The same landscape that had nearly killed him now looked like something from a fairy tale. "I should go," he said, though something in him resisted the idea. "You've been more than kind, and I've troubled you enough." Sarah snorted. "Sit, eat. Sun is high, but snow is deep. You leave now, you get lost again." She was right, of course, in this unmarked white wilderness. Finding his ranch would be like finding a needle in a haystack. Thomas sat back down, suddenly aware of how his presence must complicate things for these women. "Won't there be trouble?" he asked. If anyone finds out you helped me." The sisters exchanged a look he couldn't interpret. Mary set down her beadwork, her dark eyes serious. "There is always trouble," she said. "Our father was killed at Sand Creek. You know this place." Thomas nodded slowly. He'd heard of Sand Creek, a massacre. Some called it, though others used different words. Army troops had attacked a peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho camp, killing women and children along with the men. "Our mother was Apache," Mary continued. "She brought us back to her people after father died. But soldiers came to our village too. She got sick after, never got well again." "I'm sorry," Thomas said, the words feeling inadequate. I'm truly sorry." "Your sorry does not bring them back," Sarah said bluntly. "But you did not hold the gun, so we do not blame you." It was more grace than he probably deserved. Thomas thought he'd never held a gun against Indians. True, but he'd never questioned the stories he'd been told either. Never wondered about the other side of the frontier tale. "How did you learn English?" he asked, wanting to know more about these remarkable women. "Mission school," Mary said, and something in her tone suggested it wasn't a happy memory. "They took us when we were small. Said they would make us civilized." She spoke the last word like it tasted bitter. "We learned their words, their ways, but we came back to our people when we could." "Must have been hard," Thomas ventured. Sarah laughed, short and sharp. "Hard. They cut our hair, beat us for speaking Apache, told us our ways were savage. Yes, hard." Thomas felt shame creep up his neck. He'd never thought about what civilizing meant to those being civilized. In his world, it had always been presented as a gift, a raising up. But sitting here with these two women who moved with such grace and competence in their own world, he began to see the arrogance in that assumption. The morning wore on, and as the sisters went about their daily tasks, Thomas found himself drawn into their rhythm. Sarah showed him how she'd made a shelter for the horses that could withstand the worst storms. Using techniques her people had developed over generations, Mary demonstrated the plants she gathered for medicine, dried and stored in painted containers. "This one," she said, holding up a dried leaf, "brings down fever. This stops bleeding. This helps with pain in the joints." "My mother used to gather herbs back home." Thomas said, "Feverfew and chamomile. Things like that. But she never knew as much as you do." "Your mothers forgot." Sarah said, "Long time ago, they knew. But they chose to forget, to buy from stores instead of learning from the land." Around midday, when the sun was at its highest, they heard horses approaching. Thomas tensed, his hand moving instinctively to where his gun would be, except he'd left it in his saddlebags. Mary and Sarah exchanged quick words in Apache, and Sarah picked up a rifle that had been leaning against the teepee wall. "Stay inside," Mary told Thomas. "Let us see who comes." But Thomas had already recognized one of the voices outside. Jim Henderson from the Double Bar Ranch. Along with what sounded like two other men, they were looking for him. Most likely, it would be known by now that he hadn't made it home in the storm. "That's Mary Singer and her sister," he heard Jim say. "The ones who wouldn't go to the agency. Bet they know something about Garrett if he came this way." Thomas stood. Decision made. Whatever happened, he wouldn't cower inside while these women faced questions about him. He pushed through the tent flap, squinting in the brilliant sunshine. "Jim," he called. "I'm here." 3 men on horseback turned to stare at him. Jim Henderson, a weathered man in his 40s who'd always been civil to Thomas, and 2 younger cowboys he recognized but didn't know well. "Well, I'll be damned," Jim said. "We figured you were frozen solid somewhere. What are you doing here?" "These ladies saved my life," Thomas said simply. "Gave me shelter in the storm." One of the younger men, a hard-faced fellow named Carl, spit tobacco juice into the snow. "Ladies, these are runaways. Garrett, supposed to be on the reservation." "The reservation is a prison," Sarah said coldly. her rifle held casually but ready. "We harm no one here." "That ain't the point," Carl started, but Jim held up a hand. "The point," Jim said slowly, "is that Thomas is alive when he might not have been that right, Garrett." Thomas stepped forward, placing himself partially between the men and the sisters. "That's right, I owe them my life, and I'll thank you not to bring trouble to their door because of it." The tension stretched tight as a bowstring. Thomas had never challenged anyone before, had always gone along to get along, but something had shifted in him during the night, some understanding that there were things worth standing up for. "You taking their side?" Carl demanded. "Against your own kind. I'm taking the side of human decency." Thomas replied, "The storm didn't care about lines on paper or the color of our skin. Neither did their kindness." Jim studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Glad you're alive? Garrett, your cattle are scattered but not lost. We can help you round them up when you're ready." He turned his horse, and after a moment's hesitation, the other two followed. Carl looked back once, his expression promising this wasn't over, but they left without further word. Thomas stood watching until they disappeared over a rise, then turned back to find both sisters watching him with unreadable expressions. "You did not have to do that," Mary said quietly. "Yes," Thomas said, "I did." Sarah lowered her rifle, something like approval in her eyes. "You learn fast, white man. Maybe you survive after all." They went back inside, but something had changed. The simple act of standing up for them had created a shift in their dynamic. Thomas was no longer just a stranger they'd saved from the storm. He was someone who'd chosen a side, and that choice would have consequences. As afternoon shadows grew long and Thomas prepared to leave, Mary pressed a small leather pouch into his hand. "Tea," she said, "for when the cold gets into your bones." Sarah had saddled Belle and now handed him the reins. "Your ranch is that way." She pointed east. "Follow the creek until you see the twin pines. Then turn north. You will see your fence line." "Thank you," Thomas said, wishing he had better words. "For everything. Can I come back to visit? I mean, to bring supplies or help with anything you need?" The sisters looked at each other, conducting one of their silent conversations. "You may come," Sarah said finally. "But carefully, those men will watch you now." Thomas understood, by defending them. He'd marked himself as an Indian sympathizer in some people's eyes, but as he mounted Belle and looked down at the two women who'd saved his life, he found he didn't care. "I'll be careful," he promised, "but I'll come," as he rode away, following Sarah's directions through the pristine snow. Thomas felt the weight of change settling on his shoulders. He'd entered that teepee as one man and was leaving as another. The storm had brought him more than near death. It had brought him understanding, connection, and perhaps most dangerously, the first stirrings of something that might grow into love. Behind him, smoke rose from the teepee into the clear winter sky, and ahead lay his ranch and all the complications his choice would bring. But for now, there was only the crunch of snow under Belle's hooves and the certainty that his life had taken a turn he never could have imagined. Spring came slowly to Wyoming that year, the snow retreating grudgingly to reveal the brown earth beneath. Thomas found himself riding toward the teepee more often than he'd intended, always with some excuse, supplies to share, news from town, questions about the herbs Mary had given him. Each visit stretched longer than the last, and neither sister seemed to mind. He learned their routines, their rhythms. Sarah rose with the sun to tend the horses and check her snares. Mary spent mornings gathering plants when the weather allowed, afternoons working on beadwork or preparing medicines. They moved around each other with the easy grace of long practice. And gradually, Thomas found his place in their pattern. "You're getting soft," Sarah told him one April morning, watching as he struggled to help her repair the horse shelter. "Your hands are like a clerk's, not a rancher's." Thomas looked at his palms, calloused from ranch work but clumsy with the tools she used. "Show me again," he said. And she did, her strong hands guiding his until he understood the technique. Mary often smiled now when he arrived, a subtle lightening of her features that made his heart beat faster. She taught him Apache words, simple things at first: water, sky, friend. He mangled the pronunciation terribly, making both sisters laugh, but he kept trying. "Why do you want to learn?" Mary asked one afternoon as they walked along the creek, looking for the early shoots she used in her remedies. "Because it matters to you," Thomas said honestly. "And because I'm tired of only knowing one way to see the world." She stopped walking, studying him with those dark, perceptive eyes. "You are not like the other white men who come here." "How am I different?" "You listen. You try to understand instead of just taking what you want." They were standing close enough that he could see flecks of gold in her brown eyes, could smell the sage and sweetgrass that always seemed to cling to her hair. The moment stretched between them, full of possibility and danger. "Mary," he began, but she stepped back, shaking her head slightly. "Not yet," she said softly. "There is too much between our peoples. Too much blood. Too much sorrow." Thomas wanted to argue, to say that what was between them had nothing to do with their peoples. But he knew she was right. The divide was real, carved by years of violence and mistrust. Yet he couldn't stop the feeling growing in his chest. Couldn't pretend he came here just for the education anymore. Sarah knew. Of course. Sarah, with her sharp eyes and sharper tongue, saw everything. "You look at my sister like a starving man looks at bread," she told him one day when Mary was out of earshot. "But you are not starving, and she is not bread to fill your emptiness." "I know that," Thomas said quietly. "I respect her. I respect both of you." "Respect?" Sarah tested the word like she was tasting something foreign. "Yes, I think you do, but respect is not enough. If you want more, you must be more." "Tell me how." Thomas said, "Tell me what I need to do." Sarah studied him for a long moment. "Help us plant," she said finally. "Stay for the growing season. Learn our ways not just with your head, but with your hands. Then maybe you will understand." So Thomas split his time between his ranch and their camp. His own garden had always been haphazard, just enough to supplement what he bought in town. But the sisters' garden was a marvel of efficiency and knowledge. They knew which plants helped others grow, which ones kept pests away, how to read the soil and the sky. "Everything is connected," Mary explained, showing him how to plant the three sisters' corn, beans, and squash together. The corn gives the beans a place to climb. The beans make the soil rich. The squash leaves shade the ground and keep it moist. They are stronger together than alone. Thomas heard the larger lesson in her words, saw how it applied to more than just vegetables. He threw himself into the work, learning to read the subtle signs of weather, to understand which phase of the moon was best for planting, to prepare the soil with the same care he'd once reserved for his rifle. His hands grew harder, his movements more sure. Sarah nodded approval when he correctly identified which seedlings needed thinning, when he knew without being told that rain was coming. The change wasn't just in his knowledge. It was deeper, in the way he moved through the world. Word got back to town. Of course, Thomas Garrett spending all his time with those Apache women. Some folks just shook their heads. Others were less kind. "You're making a fool of yourself," Jim Henderson told him when they met at the general store. "People are talking." "Let them talk," Thomas said, loading supplies into his wagon. "It's not just talk, son. Carl Bradley and some others, they're saying you've gone native. That kind of reputation. It'll hurt your business. Nobody wants to buy cattle from an Indian lover." The slur made Thomas's jaw clench, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Then I'll sell to someone who does, or I won't sell at all." Jim sighed. "I'm trying to help you, boy. Those women, they're not your kind. Whatever you think is happening there, it can't end well." My kind, Thomas repeated. You know what, Jim, I used to think I knew what that meant. Now I'm not so sure it matters as much as I thought. He left Jim standing there and drove his wagon out of town, but the conversation stayed with him. He knew Jim was right about the practical consequences. Already, some of the merchants in town were less friendly. Some of the other ranchers less willing to help with the shared work of the range. But when he arrived at the camp and saw Mary's face light up at his approach, when Sarah nodded her gruff approval at the supplies he'd brought, when they worked together in the garden as the afternoon sun slanted golden across the land, none of that seemed to matter. "You're troubled," Mary observed that evening as they sat by the fire. Sarah had retired early, leaving them alone with the crackling flames and the vast canopy of stars. "Jim Henderson warned me about my reputation," Thomas admitted. "Said I'm hurting my business by spending time here." Mary was quiet for a long moment. "He is probably right," she said finally. "Your people do not like when someone crosses the lines they have drawn. They're not lines I drew." "No, but you benefit from them whether you drew them or not." She poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward. "That is what Sarah means when she says you must be more. It is easy to say the lines don't matter when you can step back across them whenever you choose." The truth of it stung, but Thomas couldn't deny it. He could return to his white world whenever things got too difficult here. Mary and Sarah had no such option. "Then I won't step back," he said. "I'll stay on this side." Mary turned to look at him fully. "You say that now, in the quiet of evening with a full belly and peaceful heart? But what about when the soldiers come, when your neighbors turn against you, when staying on this side costs you everything?" "I don't know," Thomas admitted. "But I know that going back to the way I was before, that would cost me more." She reached out then, her fingers briefly touching his hand. "You are learning," she said softly. "Maybe there is hope after all." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire die to embers. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and another answered. The sound used to make Thomas uneasy, but now it just seemed part of the night's music, no more threatening than the wind in the grass. "I should go," he said eventually, though every part of him wanted to stay. "Yes," Mary agreed, but she didn't move to get up. "Thomas." "Yeah." "That night in the storm, when you came to our door, Sarah wanted to turn you away. She said it would only bring trouble." "Why didn't she?" "Because I asked her not to. Because when I saw you standing there, frozen and lost, I saw something in your eyes. Not the hardness we usually see in white men, not the hunger or the hatred. Just need, simple human need." "And now?" Thomas asked. "What do you see now?" Mary smiled, the expression transforming her face in the dying firelight. "Now I see possibility. I see a man trying to become more than what he was taught to be. It is encouraging." Thomas felt warmth bloom in his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. "Mary, Go home, Thomas," she said gently. "Think about what you're choosing, because once certain paths are taken, there is no going back." He stood reluctantly, knowing she was right. But as he saddled Belle and prepared to ride home under the star-filled sky, Thomas knew his choice was already made. It had been made that night in the blizzard when 2 Apache women showed him kindness he didn't deserve. Everything since had just been learning to live with that choice. The next morning, he would return. He would help tend the garden, learn new words in Apache, weather the disapproval of his neighbors. He would stay on this side of the line, no matter what it cost, because somewhere between that first cup of tea and this quiet evening by the fire, Thomas Garrett had discovered that home wasn't just a place, it was the people who welcomed you in from the storm. 2 years later, the valley had transformed. Where once Thomas's ranch stood in isolation, now a small cluster of buildings had grown up around it. The change hadn't happened overnight, but gradually, as word spread of a place where folks could live differently. where the old divisions didn't hold as much sway. It started with Pete Warner, a freed slave from Texas who'd been working the railroad camps. He'd shown up one autumn day with his wife Ruth and their 3 children, looking for work and a place to settle. Thomas had hired him on, and when Pete proved himself a skilled carpenter, they'd built him a cabin on the north section of the land. Then came the Brennan family, Irish immigrants who'd faced their own share of prejudice in the eastern cities. Mike Brennan was a blacksmith by trade, and his wife Catherine knew more about raising chickens than anyone Thomas had ever met. They built near the creek, where Mike set up his forge. Others followed, Jose and Maria Vasquez, who'd lost their California ranch to new laws that didn't recognize old Spanish land grants. Chen Wei, a former railroad worker who'd saved enough to bring his family from China. Even some white families who didn't fit in with the town's rigid ways, like the widow Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, who scandalized proper society by wearing trousers and running her own freight business. At the center of it all was the school. It had been Sarah's idea, surprisingly enough. "Children need learning," she'd announced one day. "Not just white learning or Apache learning, real learning. How to read the land and read books. How to speak many tongues and understand many ways." The building went up in a month, everyone contributing what they could. Thomas donated lumber. Mike Brennan forged the hardware. Pete Warner led the construction. The Apache sisters provided knowledge that no traditional school would teach: how to identify edible plants, track animals, read weather signs, understand the natural world. Sarah became the teacher, her command of English now supplemented with Spanish and even some Chinese phrases she'd picked up from the Wei children. She taught with the same no-nonsense approach she brought to everything, but the children adored her. Thomas stood in the doorway of the school one bright September morning, watching Sarah lead a mixed group of children: Apache, Mexican, Chinese, Black, Irish, and white. In a lesson about the seasons, they sat in a circle on the floor, no separation by race or background, just children learning together. "And what does the Golden Eagle tell us?" Sarah was asking. Multiple hands shot up. "Winter's coming," young James Brennan called out. "Good. And how do we prepare?" The children launched into animated discussion about food storage, firewood, and shelter repairs. Thomas smiled, remembering his own ignorance about such things not so long ago. A hand touched his shoulder, and he turned to find Mary beside him, his wife now, as of 6 months ago, in a ceremony that blended Apache tradition with the legal requirements of the territory. She wore a simple calico dress, but her hair was still long and braided in the Apache way, decorated with the silver clips he'd given her as a wedding gift. "The Indian agent comes today," she said quietly. "Ruth Miller sent word." Thomas nodded, his jaw tightening. They'd known this was coming. A community like theirs couldn't stay hidden forever, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs didn't look kindly on Apache living free, especially when they were influencing white settlers. "How many men?" 20 soldiers, plus the agent. They'll be here by noon." Thomas pulled out his pocket watch. Barely 2 hours. "All right, let's get everyone ready." They'd planned for this, discussed it in countless community meetings around the fire. No violence. That would only give the authorities excuse to destroy everything they'd built. Instead, they would stand on the law, such as it was, and on their unity. By the time the dust cloud of approaching horses appeared on the horizon, the entire community had gathered in the center of the settlement. The children were inside the school with Catherine Brennan and Maria Vasquez, while the adults formed a loose line in front of the buildings. No one was armed, but they stood straight and unafraid. The Indian agent was a thin man named Josiah Pendleton, with the pinched look of someone who'd found life consistently disappointing. He rode at the front of the column, soldiers flanking him, their blue uniforms stark against the autumn landscape. Mr. Garrett," Pendleton said without dismounting, "I'm told you're the leader of this assembly." "No leader. Thomas replied calmly. Just neighbors, working together. Pendleton's lips pursed. I see. And these Apache women, they would be Mary and Sarah Singer, listed as runaways from the White Mountain Reservation. My wife and sister-in-law, Thomas said, legal residents of this territory. The law is quite clear. Mr. Garrett. All Apache must reside on designated reservation lands unless employed by a licensed white citizen. Pendleton pulled out an official-looking document. I have orders to return these women to the reservation immediately. I employ them. Eleanor Patterson spoke up. Have done for 2 years. Got the paperwork right here if you'd like to see it. As do I, Mike Brennan added. Hired them to teach my children. Proper employment, all legal-like. One by one, every white member of the community spoke up, each claiming to employ Mary and Sarah in some capacity. It was a fiction, but one that might hold up to legal scrutiny. Pendleton's face reddened. This is clearly a sham, a conspiracy to circumvent federal law. Prove it, Thomas said quietly. We have employment records, tax documents, witnesses. Unless you have evidence that these arrangements are fraudulent, you have no authority here. The agent turned to the Army captain beside him. Captain Morrison, I order you to take these women into custody. The captain, a weathered man with gray at his temples, looked uncomfortable. Sir, if they have legal documentation. Documents can be forged. Yes, sir, but without proof of forgery. I can't arrest American citizens on private property. That would exceed my authority. While Pendleton sputtered, Ruth Miller stepped forward. Thomas had sent word to her husband's ranch, knowing they would need all the help they could get. Ruth was a formidable woman, tall and broad-shouldered, with a voice that could carry across a canyon. Mr. Pendleton, she said, I believe you know my husband, Judge Harold Miller. He asked me to deliver this letter to you. Pendleton took the letter with visible reluctance and read it, his face growing even more pinched. This is highly irregular. What's irregular? Ruth said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Is government agents trying to break up lawful families and peaceful communities? My husband wanted me to remind you that the territorial governor takes a dim view of actions that might disturb the peace, especially when they involve tax-paying citizens who've broken no laws. The threat was subtle but clear. Judge Miller had influence, and the governor was already dealing with enough problems without adding a potentially embarrassing incident to his plate. But it was what happened next that Thomas would remember for the rest of his life. From the schoolhouse, soft at first but growing stronger, came the sound of children singing. Sarah must have started them, but now 24 young voices rose together, singing America the Beautiful, in a mixture of English, Spanish, Apache, and Chinese. The words were jumbled, the pronunciation sometimes off, but the harmony was perfect. Soldiers shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. These weren't faceless enemies. These were children, American children by birth or choice, singing their country's song in all the languages that made it great. Indians, Chen Wei said in his careful English, stepping forward. I come from China. They call me worse than Indian. But here, my children learn beside all children. They become American, real American. You take away their teachers, you take away their hope. My family fled starvation in Ireland. Mike Brennan added. Came here with nothing, found welcome with these people you call savage. Who's more civilized, them that shares their knowledge, or them that would tear families apart? Jose Vasquez, whose English was still rough, spoke in Spanish with his wife translating. My family lived on this land for generations before it became American. These Apache women teach my children the old ways and the new. This is what America promised. A place for all people. Even some of the soldiers seemed moved. Captain Morrison cleared his throat. Mr. Pendleton, perhaps we should return to the fort and seek clarification from headquarters. The situation seems complex. Pendleton looked around at the assembled community, Apache and Mexican, Chinese and Irish, black and white, all standing together. His authority had been built on divisions, on the assumption that these groups would never unite. Faced with their solidarity, he seemed to shrink. "This isn't over," he said finally. "I'll be back with proper warrants." "You do that." Thomas said, "We'll be here. This is our home." As the column of soldiers rode away, dust rising in their wake, a cheer went up from the community. Children poured out of the schoolhouse, running to their parents. Thomas found himself surrounded by neighbors, all talking at once, relief and triumph mixing in their voices. But it was Mary's eyes he sought, Mary's smile that made his heart soar. She came to him through the crowd, their infant son James cradled in her arms, the baby, named for both Thomas's father and the Brennan boy who'd first befriended Sarah's students, had his father's blue eyes and his mother's dark hair. A living bridge between worlds. "You did well," Mary said softly. "All of you." "We did it together," Thomas replied, wrapping his arms around his family. "That's the only way it works." Sarah approached. The usual stern lines of her face softened with something that might have been pride. "They will come back," she warned. "With more men, more papers." "Maybe," Thomas agreed. "But today we showed them something. We showed them that their old ways of dividing people don't work here. We're not Apache or white or Mexican or Chinese. We're neighbors. We're family." As the sun set over their small community, casting long shadows across the gardens and buildings they'd raised together, Thomas felt the truth of his words. 2 years ago, he'd been one man alone, shaped by fear and ignorance. Now he was part of something larger, something that transcended the boundaries others tried to impose. The battle wasn't over, might never be truly over, but here in this valley, they'd carved out a space where different could coexist, where children could learn from many traditions, where love could cross any boundary. And it had all started with a storm, 2 Apache sisters, and a choice to open a door instead of turning away. Dawn broke cold and clear over the valley, the kind of crisp autumn morning that turned breath to mist and painted frost on the grass. Thomas stood on his porch, coffee mug warming his hands, watching the sun paint the mountains gold. It would have been peaceful, except for the dust cloud rising from the east, too large to be anything but trouble. "They're coming," Mary said from behind him. She'd risen early to feed baby James, and now stood in the doorway, the child sleeping against her shoulder. "Yeah," Thomas said quietly. "Ruth's message," said Dawn. "Pendleton kept his word about coming back." This time there were more than 20 soldiers. Thomas counted at least 40 men, plus supply wagons. They meant business, but the community was ready too. They'd spent the last 3 weeks preparing for this moment. Sarah emerged from her cabin, already dressed and alert. She'd moved into her own place the previous spring, a small but sturdy home that Pete Warner had helped her build. "The children?" she asked. "Already at the church cellar with Catherine and Maria." Mary replied, "They'd built the church just 6 months ago, a simple wooden structure that served all faiths. Or none at all. Its root cellar, supposedly for food storage, could shelter all the community's children if needed. One by one, the adults of the community gathered in the central square. They'd rehearsed this, but Thomas could see the fear beneath the determination on many faces. Federal authority was not something to challenge lightly, especially for those who'd already fled persecution once. The column approached with military precision, but something was different this time. Riding beside Pendleton was a man Thomas didn't recognize, older, with silver hair and bearing that suggested higher rank. Behind them, surprisingly, rode Judge Harold Miller himself. They stopped at the edge of the settlement, and the silver-haired man dismounted first. "I'm Colonel Samuel Richards," he announced, "Federal Marshal for the territory. I understand there's been some dispute about the legal status of certain residents here." "No dispute," Thomas said, stepping forward. Everyone here is lawfully present. Richards studied him with sharp, gray eyes. You'd be Thomas Garrett, the one who married an Apache woman. I married my wife. Thomas said simply, "Who happens to be Apache?" "Yes." "And started quite an interesting community here." Richards gestured to the buildings, the gardens still heavy with late harvest. "Mister, Pendleton tells me you're harboring fugitives from the reservation system." "We're harboring no one. We're neighbors, living and working together within the law." Ruth Miller stepped up beside Thomas. "My husband can explain the legal particulars." "Colonel." Judge Miller dismounted, his usually stern face carefully neutral. He was taking a risk being here. Thomas knew associating too closely with their community could hurt his career, but Harold Miller was a man who took his oath to uphold justice seriously. "Colonel Richards," the judge began, "I've reviewed all the documentation these people have provided. Employment records, tax payments, legal marriages properly registered. Unless the government can prove fraud with evidence, not assumptions, these Apache women have every right to be here." "Legal technicalities." Pendleton spat. "Everyone knows it's a sham." "What I know," Colonel Richards interrupted, "is that I was sent here to investigate reports of Apache causing trouble, threatening white settlers, possibly planning raids." He looked around at the peaceful community, the well-tended gardens, the school and church. "What I find instead is this." He walked forward, and the crowd parted to let him through. Thomas noticed how his eyes took in every detail, the shared well at the center of the community, the way houses were arranged to support and protect each other, the mix of architectural styles that somehow worked together. "Show me your school," Richards ordered. Sarah stepped forward. "The children are at their prayers." She said it wasn't entirely a lie. Catherine Brennan was probably praying quite fervently right now. "Then show me the building." They walked to the school, Richards examining everything with the thoroughness of a man used to cutting through deception. He studied the books, McGuffey readers next to texts Sarah had written herself in Apache and English, maps on the walls, arithmetic on the chalkboard, children's drawings depicting their families, all colors, all kinds, all together. "You teach here?" he asked Sarah. "I do." "And the white children learn alongside Apache?" "Alongside Apache, Mexican, Chinese, black," Sarah replied steadily. "Children are children. Colonel, they all need learning." Richards picked up one of Sarah's handwritten texts, flipping through pages that showed Apache words alongside English translations. "This is quite comprehensive. You created this yourself. With help from my sister and others, we believe children should understand many languages, many ways of seeing the world." "Dangerous thinking, some would say." Sarah met his gaze squarely. "Ignorance is more dangerous than knowledge." "Colonel." They returned to the square, where Richards addressed Pendleton. "I see no evidence of the threats to public safety I was told about. What I see is a functioning community that appears to be an asset to the territory." "But the law," Pendleton began. "The law is complex, Mr. Pendleton. Yes, there are regulations about reservation boundaries. There are also laws about property rights, legal marriage, employment contracts, and religious freedom." He glanced at the church. "I assume that building serves all denominations." "It does," Thomas confirmed. "Apache ceremonies, Christian services, sometimes both. We've even had Jewish prayers when the traveling merchant Mr. Goldman visits." "Interesting." Richards turned to Captain Morrison. "Captain, do you see any threat to public safety here?" Morrison, who'd been quietly observing, shook his head. "No, sir. Seems peaceful enough. More peaceful than some white towns I've seen." It was then that Jim Henderson rode in. Thomas tensed. Jim had warned him once about his choices, but the older rancher dismounted and walked straight to Colonel Richards. "Colonel, I'm Jim Henderson, Double Bar Ranch. Been in this territory 15 years. I came to say my piece about these folks." "Go ahead," Richards said. Jim took off his hat, turning it in his hands. "I wasn't sure about this place at first. Warned Garrett he was making a mistake, but I've watched what they've built here, and I was wrong." He looked at Thomas. "When my ranch hands came down with fever last spring, it was Sarah Singer who rode out with medicine. Probably saved 2 lives. When the Vasquez family's crop failed, this whole community pitched in to help them through." He turned back to Richards. "I fought Apache in my younger days. Colonel, killed my share and saw friends killed. But these people here, they're trying something different. Maybe it's time we let them try." A murmur ran through the crowd. Jim Henderson's words carried weight. He was respected, established, undeniably white and American. His support meant something. But Pendleton wasn't finished. "This is all very touching," he said. "But the law is clear. These women are enrolled members of the White Mountain Apache tribe. They belong on the reservation unless they choose otherwise." A new voice interrupted. Everyone turned to see an elderly Apache man stepping forward, accompanied by 2 younger men. Thomas recognized him. Robert Crowfeather, one of the Apache leaders who'd been working with the government to find peaceful solutions. "Uncle," Mary breathed, and Thomas realized this was her mother's brother. Crowfeather spoke in Apache to Mary and Sarah, then turned to address Richards in English. "These are my sister's daughters. They were taken to the white school as children, then returned to us, then lost to us again when their mother died." He looked at Pendleton with barely concealed contempt. "The reservation you speak of like it is our home. It is a prison. Poor land. Not enough water, no game. Our children starve there." "The government provides rations," Pendleton began. "When they come. If they come. Often spoiled. Always insufficient." Crowfeather's voice carried the weight of years of broken promises. "My nieces found another way. They make peace not through surrender, but through strength, through teaching, through building. This is also the Apache way, to adapt, to survive, to find allies where we can." He looked at Colonel Richards. "I speak for the tribal council. We do not demand their return. If they choose this path, we support them. The reservation loses 2 mouths to feed. Perhaps that helps the agent balance his books." The insult to Pendleton was clear, but Richards raised a hand before the agent could respond. "Mr. Crowfeather, you're saying the tribe voluntarily releases any claim to these women?" "I am saying they are Apache wherever they live. But if papers matter to you, yes, we release them to follow their own path." Richards nodded slowly, then turned to survey the entire assembled community. "I've seen enough," he announced. "Mr. Pendleton, I'll be recommending to the territorial governor that no action be taken here. These people are living peacefully, productively, and within the letter if not the spirit of the law. Moreover, they're creating something that might serve as a model for future relations between peoples." "This is outrageous." Pendleton's face was nearly purple. "You're condoning miscegenation, harboring fugitives, undermining federal authority." "I'm preventing bloodshed," Richards cut him off. "Or would you prefer another Sand Creek, another Camp Grant? How many more massacres before we learn that force alone solves nothing?" He mounted his horse. "Captain Morrison, prepare your men to depart. Mr. Pendleton, I suggest you focus your efforts on the actual problems at the reservation, the lack of supplies, the corrupt contractors, the things that drive people to flee in the first place." As the federal party prepared to leave, Judge Miller approached Thomas. "You've won this round," he said quietly. "But Pendleton's not wrong about the challenges to federal authority. There will be others who see what you're doing here as a threat. Be careful." "We will be," Thomas assured him. "And Judge, thank you." Miller almost smiled. "Don't thank me. Thank your community. What I saw here today, it gives me hope that perhaps this territory might become something special when statehood comes. a place where the law serves justice, not just power. As the dust settled from the departing column, the community erupted in celebration. Children emerged from the church cellar, running to their parents. Robert Crowfeather was surrounded by Mary and Sarah, the three of them speaking rapidly in Apache. Years of separation melting away. Thomas found himself at the center of a crowd, everyone talking at once, relief and joy mixing with lingering fear. But it was Pete Warner who said what they were all thinking. "We did it," the former slave said, his voice full of wonder. "All of us together, Apache, Mexican, Chinese, Irish. Folks like me who've known chains. Folks like Thomas who chose to break different chains. We stood together and we won." "Today we won," Sarah corrected, ever practical. "Tomorrow will bring new challenges. But yes, today we stood as one people. That matters." As the sun climbed higher, warming the chill from the air, the community dispersed to daily tasks, but with a lighter step than before. The confrontation they dreaded had come and gone, and they'd prevailed not through violence, but through unity. Through the simple power of refusing to be divided. Thomas stood with his arm around Mary, watching their son reach for the bright feathers in Robert Crowfeather's hair. The old man smiled, speaking to the child in Apache, ensuring another generation would know their heritage. "What did we start here?" Thomas asked Mary quietly. She leaned into him, considering something new from something old. The Apache way has always been to adapt, to take what works from others while keeping our core strong. You whites called it going native when someone learned from us. But look around. Everyone here is learning from everyone else. We're all going native to a new kind of nation. It was a profound thought, and Thomas turned it over in his mind as the day unfolded around them. They'd won more than a legal victory today. They'd proven that the future didn't have to look like the past, that people could choose cooperation over conquest, understanding over ignorance. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but today, in this small valley in Wyoming territory, they'd shown it was possible to walk that road together. The Harvest Festival came on a perfect October day. The sky so blue it hurt to look at, and the air crisp with the promise of winter. The entire valley buzzed with preparation. Tables made from sawhorses and planks lined the central square, covered with bright cloths and slowly filling with food from every kitchen in the community. Mary stood at their cabin door, adjusting Thomas's collar. He wore his best shirt, the one she'd made him with careful stitches and small decorative elements that showed Apache influence without being obvious about it. "You're nervous," she observed, smoothing the fabric across his shoulders. "Course I am," Thomas admitted. "Never given a speech to this many people before." "Speak from here," she said, placing her hand over his heart. "That's where your best words come from." Outside, the community transformed the everyday into something magical. Chen Wei's wife had strung paper lanterns between buildings, their red and gold paper glowing in the afternoon sun. The Vasquez family had decorated the square with bright papel picado, the intricate cut paper fluttering like butterflies in the breeze. Mike Brennan's children had woven cornstalks and autumn leaves into garlands that draped the school and church. Sarah supervised the arrangement of food with her usual efficiency, but Thomas caught her smiling more than usual. She wore a traditional Apache dress for the occasion, beautifully beaded, that she'd spent months making. "Put the Irish stew next to the pozole," she directed Catherine Brennan. The bread there, between the fry bread and the tortillas, it was deliberate, Thomas realized, the mixing of foods from different cultures, set side by side, available to all. A table that told their story without words. People arrived throughout the afternoon, not just their immediate community, but neighbors from miles around. Jim Henderson came with his family, bringing two of his hands who'd been curious about this mixed settlement. The traveling merchant Goldman arrived with his wagon, contributing wine and dried fruits from California. Even some folks from town who'd been skeptical before showed up, drawn by curiosity and the promise of good food. Robert Crowfeather sat in a place of honor, having extended his stay to spend time with his nieces. He'd brought 2 other Apache families with him, relatives who were considering leaving the reservation to join the community. They watched everything with careful eyes, weighing this new way of living against the harsh certainties they knew. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting everything gold, Thomas climbed onto a makeshift platform Pete Warner had built. The crowd gradually quieted, faces turning up to him, brown and white and black and every shade between, united in this moment of celebration. Thomas cleared his throat, his prepared words suddenly seeming inadequate. Then he caught Mary's eye, saw her encouraging nod, and spoke from his heart instead. "When I first came to this valley," he began, his voice carrying across the square, "I thought I knew what it meant to survive. I had my land, my cattle, my gun. I had walls, real ones around my property, and invisible ones around my heart. I thought that was strength." He paused, looking out at the assembled faces. Then a storm came, not just any storm, but the kind that strips away pretense, that shows you what really matters. And in that storm, I found shelter, not just from the wind and snow, but from the loneliness that was killing me slower than any blizzard could. 2 sisters opened their door to me that night. They didn't see an enemy or a stranger. They saw a human being in need, and they acted with the simple kindness that we've somehow made complicated in this world. That night changed everything. Thomas saw nods from those who knew the story, curious looks from those who didn't. He continued, "Each of you has a story like that. A moment when someone reached across the divide of race, of religion, of old hurts and older fears. Pete and Ruth, fleeing the shadows of slavery, found welcome here. Mike and Catherine, carrying the grief of Ireland's hunger, found full tables and open hearts. Jose and Maria, dispossessed of land their families worked for generations, found a place to plant new roots. We're told this shouldn't work. We're told that Apache and white, Mexican and Chinese, former slave and freeborn, Catholic and Protestant, and those who pray in different ways. We're told we can't live together, work together, build together. But look around you." The crowd did look at neighbors become friends, at children who played without thought of the differences their parents had been taught to fear, at the evidence of their shared labor in buildings and gardens and the feast before them. "We've proven them wrong," Thomas said, his voice growing stronger. "Not through force, not through law alone, but through something simpler and more powerful, through choosing to see each other as people first, through Sarah teaching all our children, not just Apache ones, through Mike fixing everyone's tools, not just Irish ones, through Maria sharing her recipes, Chen Wei sharing his seeds, Ruth sharing her strength, and yes, through Mary and others sharing medicine that heals without asking what color the sick person is." He saw Sarah standing straight and proud, Mary holding their son, the faces of his neighbors reflecting the last light of day. "This hasn't been easy. There have been nights I've lain awake wondering if we were fools, if the forces against us were too strong. When Pendleton came with his soldiers, I saw some of you thinking the same, but we stood together, and we prevailed. Not because we were perfect, but because we refused to be divided. I want to say something to our newer neighbors, to those still deciding if this is home." He looked at the Apache family's crow feather had brought. "This isn't about giving up who you are. Sarah hasn't become less Apache here, if anything. She's taught us all to appreciate Apache wisdom. The Vasquez family hasn't abandoned their Mexican heritage. They've enriched us with it. Chen Wei's children speak Chinese at home and English at school, and Apache words they've learned from their friends. And they're stronger for it, not weaker." Eleanor Patterson called out, "That's right," and laughter rippled through the crowd. "We're building something new here," Thomas continued. "Not a place where differences don't matter, but where they're celebrated. Where a white rancher can learn farming from Apache women. Where former slaves can own land and build alongside anyone else. Where children grow up seeing the world through many eyes instead of just one narrow view." He found Mary's face again, drew strength from her smile. I stand before you a different man than I was 3 years ago. I'm husband to an Apache woman, father to a child who'll grow up belonging to multiple worlds, neighbor to people I was taught to fear or dismiss. And I'm richer for it. We all are. So tonight, as we share this feast, as we celebrate the harvest and the community that made it possible, remember this: we are writing a different story. Not the story of conquest and division that's bloodied this land for too long, but a story of people choosing to build something better, together. Thomas stepped down to applause and cheers, embarrassed by the attention but moved by the response. People surrounded him, shaking his hand, slapping his back. But it was Robert Crow Feather who approached with the most serious expression. The elderly Apache leader studied Thomas for a long moment, then spoke in accented but clear English. "You speak well for a white man who knew nothing 3 winters ago," he said. "But words are easy. It's the living that's hard." "I know," Thomas replied. "We're trying to live up to our words every day." Crow Feather nodded slowly. "I see this. I see my nieces happy, strong. I see children learning both new ways and old ways. Maybe," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "maybe there is a path between surrender and war. Maybe you are finding it." As darkness fell, the lanterns were lit, transforming the square into a magical space of light and shadow. The feast began in earnest, people moving from table to table, sampling dishes from every tradition. Children running between adults' legs, laughter mixing with music as Mike Brennan pulled out his fiddle and Jose produced a guitar. Thomas found a quiet moment with Mary as they watched their son toddle between Sarah and Catherine Brennan. Babbling in the mixed language, all the children seemed to develop naturally here. "Your speech was good," Mary said. "You found the words." "Did I say it right, all of it?" She considered. "You said what needed saying, about choosing to see each other as human, about building instead of destroying. These are good words. Now we must keep living them." As if to underscore her point, a small drama unfolded near the dessert table. One of the newer Apache children had accidentally knocked over a pie that Eleanor Patterson had brought. The boy froze, clearly expecting anger or worse. But Eleanor just laughed, helped him clean up, and cut him an extra-large piece from another pie, ruffling his hair affectionately. It was a small moment, but Thomas saw the boy's mother relax, saw her exchange a look with her husband that said maybe, just maybe, this place could be home. The celebration continued late into the night. Stories were shared in multiple languages. Children fell asleep in their parents' arms, and for a few precious hours, the outside world with all its divisions and hatreds seemed very far away. As Thomas and Mary finally made their way home, carrying their sleeping son, they passed the school where Sarah still sat with Robert Crow Feather and some of the other Apache, talking quietly in their own language, maintaining the connections that mattered while building new ones. "Look at the stars," Mary said, pausing in their walk. "Same stars over the reservation, over the white towns, over Mexico and China and everywhere else. Same stars, but people see different pictures in them." Thomas looked up at the vast Wyoming sky. The Milky Way, a river of light across the darkness. "What do you see?" "Tonight I see hope," Mary said simply. "I see a path forward lit by many small lights, like our lanterns, like our community. Small lights that together push back the darkness." They stood there for a moment, longer, their sun warm between them, the sounds of the continuing celebration drifting on the night air. Thomas thought about the journey that had brought him here, from a lonely rancher who thought strength meant standing alone to a man rich in family and community, connected to something larger than himself. Tomorrow would bring its challenges. There would be more Pendletons, more prejudice, more pressure to abandon this experiment in living differently. But tonight, surrounded by the proof of what was possible when people chose unity over division, Thomas allowed himself to believe they would meet those challenges as they had all the others, together. The Harvest Festival would become a tradition, he realized, Years from now, their son would tell his children about this night, about the time when people of all backgrounds came together to celebrate not just the crops they'd grown, but the community they'd built. It would become part of their story, one more thread in the tapestry they were weaving. As they reached their cabin door, Mary turned for one last look at the glowing square. "We've come far from that night in the storm," she said. "We have," Thomas agreed. "And we've got farther yet to go." But for tonight, they were home, all of them together, under the same stars. The years that followed brought challenges like waves against a shore, some gentle, barely noticed, others crashing with force that threatened to sweep away everything they'd built. Through it all, the community endured, adapted, grew stronger. The drought came in the 5th year, turning the prairie brown and brittle by June. Wells ran low, crops withered in the fields despite all their careful tending. Thomas stood with Jose Vasquez at the edge of what should have been a cornfield, watching dust devils dance where green stalks should have swayed. "In California," Jose said quietly, "my grandfather knew how to read the signs. When rain would come, when to plant deep, when to wait, but this land—" He shook his head. It was Sarah who brought the solution, appearing one morning with Robert Crowfeather and 3 other Apache elders. "There are old ways," she announced to the gathered community. "Springs hidden, known only to those who walked this land before the boundaries were drawn." Some of the white families were skeptical. Hidden springs sounded like wishful thinking when their children were thirsty. But Thomas had learned to trust Apache knowledge, and when Sarah led them into the hills, he was among the first to follow. The spring was there, just as the elders had promised, a small but steady flow from the rocks, feeding a pool hidden by an overhang. It wasn't enough to irrigate fields, but it would keep them alive. "Why share this?" Eleanor Patterson asked the elders through Sarah's translation. "This is sacred to your people, isn't it?" The oldest elder, a woman whose face was mapped with years of sun and struggle, spoke at length. Sarah translated. "Sacred means life-giving. What gives life is meant to be shared with those who respect it. You have shown respect. Your children learn our language, our ways. You stand with us against those who would drive us away. Water doesn't care about the color of the one who drinks." They organized water brigades, everyone taking turns hauling precious buckets down from the hills. The stronger helped the weaker, the young helped the old. Chen Wei's eldest son, now 15 and tall, carried buckets for the widow Patterson without being asked. Mike Brennan rigged up a pulley system to ease the work. The crop yield was small that year, but it was enough. More importantly, the shared struggle had bonded them even tighter. When rain finally came in September, the entire community stood in it, faces turned to the sky, children dancing in the puddles, adults weeping with relief and joy. But nature wasn't their only challenge. The territory was changing, moving toward statehood. And with that came politics and power struggles that threatened their small experiment in coexistence. A man named Harrison Blackwood arrived in the valley one spring day, dressed in the fine clothes of an Eastern businessman, accompanied by 2 lawyers and a surveyor. He claimed to have bought the rights to unclaimed land in the valley land that included part of their community. "This is claimed land," Thomas told him firmly. "Every acre is spoken for, properly filed, and improved according to law." Blackwood smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. "I'm afraid my documents say otherwise. It seems there were irregularities in some of the original filings. Indians holding land outside the reservation, for instance. Mexicans with grants from before the American period that were never properly converted. Chinese who aren't citizens and therefore can't legally own property." Thomas felt rage building in his chest, but Mary's hand on his arm reminded him to stay calm. "Our lawyers will review any documents you have," he said instead. "By all means," Blackwood said, "but I think you'll find everything is quite legal. I'm not an unreasonable man. Mr. Garrett, those who are properly qualified to own land can certainly purchase it from me at fair market value. Of course, the others will need to make arrangements to relocate. After Blackwood left, the community gathered in the church. Fear rippled through the crowd. They'd faced soldiers and Indian agents, but this attack through paperwork and legal technicalities felt more dangerous somehow. "He's trying to divide us," Pete Warner said. "Make the white folks turn against the rest to save their own land." "It won't work," Catherine Brennan declared. "We didn't come this far to let some fancy-dressed vulture tear us apart." Judge Miller rode out from town the next day, looking graver than Thomas had ever seen him. "Blackwood's papers appear legitimate," he admitted. "He's exploited every loophole, every ambiguity in the law. His lawyers are from back east, very skilled, very expensive." "So we fight," Thomas said. "With what?" the judge asked. "Legal battles cost money. Appeals, court fees, lawyer fees. Do you have those kinds of resources?" They didn't, and everyone knew it. Most families were just getting by, putting everything back into the land and the community. It was Chen Wei who surprised them all. At the next community meeting, he stood and spoke in his careful, precise English. "In China, my family were merchants. Here, I work with my hands, but also—" He paused, seeming to wrestle with a decision. "I have saved every dollar that could be spared. Gold coins hidden away, earned from the railroad camps before I came here. It is not fortune, but it is enough to start the fight." "We can't take your money," Thomas protested. "Not take," Chen Wei corrected. "Invest. I invest in our home, our future. What good is gold hidden in the ground if we lose everything above it?" Others stepped forward. The Apache families offered turquoise jewelry, old pieces that could be sold. Jose had connections in California who might help. Even the children wanted to contribute, offering to sell the crafts Sarah had taught them to make. Eleanor Patterson stood last. "I've been corresponding with friends back east," she said. "Newspaper women, suffragettes, people interested in progressive causes. They might be very interested in a story about Eastern moneymen trying to destroy a peaceful, integrated community." "Bad publicity," Judge Miller mused. "Blackwood won't like that. These types depend on working in shadows." They fought on multiple fronts. Judge Miller and a young lawyer named Timothy Adams, an idealist fresh from law school, challenged Blackwood's claims in court. Eleanor wrote article after article, sending them to papers in Denver, Chicago, even New York. Sarah organized the children to write letters to the territorial governor, describing their school and their life together. The legal battles dragged on for months. There were setbacks, a judge who ruled against them, a newspaper that refused to print Eleanor's stories, nights when it seemed Blackwood's money and connections would prevail. During the worst of it, when spirits were lowest, young James Garrett, now 5 years old and fearless, stood up at a community meeting and announced, "I'm not scared of Mr. Blackwood. He's just a bully, and Miss Sarah says bullies are weak inside." The laughter that followed broke the tension, reminded them what they were fighting for. The turning point came from an unexpected source. Jim Henderson, who'd been quietly watching the struggle, rode into their valley one day with a dozen other ranchers. "We've been talking," he announced. "What Blackwood's doing to you today, he'll do to us tomorrow. Man like that won't stop until he owns everything." They brought more than moral support. The established ranchers had connections, influence, and crucially, they had money to match Blackwood's legal fund, not because they'd suddenly become believers in racial equality, but because they recognized a common threat. "Strange bedfellows," Judge Miller commented, watching the ranchers sit down with Apache elders and Chinese farmers to plan strategy. "Maybe that's how change really happens." Thomas replied, "Not all at once, but one shared interest at a time." The final court battle was held in the territorial capital. Blackwood's lawyers were polished, professional, citing precedent and technicality. But Timothy Adams, with Judge Miller's guidance, built a different case, one based on improvement of the land, established community, and the very principles America claimed to stand for. When Chen Wei testified about transforming raw land into productive gardens, when Sarah spoke about educating children of all backgrounds, when Pete Warner described building homes for families who'd never owned anything before, the judge listened. The ruling came down in their favor. Not a complete victory. Some of Blackwood's claims were upheld, but enough. The core of their community was protected, the families secure. Blackwood left the territory soon after, seeking easier prey elsewhere. But the fight had changed them all. They'd learned they were stronger than they knew, that their experiment in living together had created something worth protecting. That evening, as the community celebrated in their familiar square, Thomas found himself standing with Mary and Sarah, watching their children play with all the others. James was teaching Apache words to the Brennan children, while Chen Wei's daughter showed them a game with string figures. "We almost lost it all," Mary said quietly. "But we didn't," Sarah added. "We stood together, white ranchers standing with Apache farmers, Chinese merchants with Mexican vaqueros. Blackwood thought he could divide us, but he only made us stronger." Thomas thought about the journey from that first night in the storm to this moment. Every challenge had been a test, and each test passed had woven them tighter together. "You know what Robert Crowfeather told me before he left?" Thomas said. "He said, we're not just building a community, we're building a new way of being American, one that doesn't erase differences but celebrates them." Pretty words. Sarah said with her characteristic skepticism, "But words don't keep away the next Blackwood, or the next drought, or the next law that says we don't belong." "No," Thomas agreed. "But the strength we build facing each challenge does. Look at us. A virgin cowboy who knew nothing, 2 Apache sisters who should have been on a reservation, and all these others who weren't supposed to mix. We're still here." "Still here," Mary repeated, smiling, "and still growing." As night fell and the celebration continued, Thomas noticed Jim Henderson deep in conversation with Chen Wei about irrigation techniques, saw Catherine Brennan learning a traditional Apache recipe from one of the elder women, watched the children chase fireflies without thought to the differences that were supposed to divide them. They would face more challenges, he knew that. The path to statehood would bring new pressures, new people who couldn't understand or accept what they'd built. But they would face them as they had all the others, together, with a strength that came from choosing to see each other as family rather than strangers. The stars came out, the same stars that had watched over them through drought and plenty, conflict and peace. Under their light, the community prepared for another day, another season, another year of proving that different peoples could not just coexist, but thrive together. 20 years had passed since that fateful night when a blizzard drove Thomas Garrett to seek shelter with 2 Apache sisters. Now, on another winter evening, snow fell gently outside as he stood before the window of the home they'd built together, larger now, expanded over the years to accommodate their growing family and the constant stream of visitors who came to see the community that had become famous across the territory. Thomas's hair had gone gray at the temples, and lines mapped the years around his eyes, laugh lines. Mary called them earned through joy more than sorrow. Behind him, the house bustled with activity. Sarah was helping her adopted daughter with homework at the kitchen table, while Mary taught their youngest, their 4th child, to braid sweetgrass the way her mother had taught her. James, now 23, and tall like his father but with his mother's sharp intelligence, burst through the door, shaking snow from his coat. "The evening train brought a surprise," he announced. "Samuel Goldman is here, the merchant's son. Says he's a journalist now. Wants to write about us for Harper's Magazine." "Another one," Sarah said dryly. "How many does that make this year?" "5, Mary answered. 6, if you count that photographer from Chicago." Their community had become something of a phenomenon as Wyoming moved toward statehood. What had started as a desperate alliance for survival had grown into a thriving town of nearly 300 souls. The school Sarah had started now had 3 teachers and students who went on to universities back east. The church served 5 different denominations and had hosted weddings between couples whose unions would have been unthinkable 2 decades ago. Thomas walked outside to greet young Goldman, finding him standing in the square, turning in slow circles as he took it all in. The young man had his father's keen eyes but carried a notebook instead of a ledger. Mr. Garrett," Goldman said, shaking his hand warmly. "My father sends his regards. He still talks about the hospitality he found here, how it changed his views on what America could be." "Your father was always welcome here." Thomas replied, "As are you, though I wonder what new angle you'll find to write about. Seems every aspect of our town has been documented by now." Goldman smiled. "I'm not here to write about your town, sir. I'm here to write about you. The virgin cowboy who took shelter with Apache sisters and changed the course of history in Wyoming territory." Thomas felt heat rise in his cheeks. "That's a bit dramatic, don't you think? And that nickname, I wish folks would let it die." "But it's part of the story," Goldman insisted. "The transformation from isolation to community, from ignorance to understanding. People need to hear how one person's choice to accept help, to open their mind, can ripple outward and change hundreds of lives." They walked through the town as evening settled in. Lanterns were being lit, a tradition that started with that first harvest festival and never stopped. The main street now boasted Goldman's general store run by the Vasquez family under a licensing agreement, the Brennan Blacksmith Shop, Chen's Agricultural Supply, and the Apache Trading Post, where Sarah and others sold traditional crafts to the increasing number of visitors. "It's not all roses," Thomas told the young journalist as they passed the sheriff's office. "We've had our troubles. There are still those who see what we've built as a threat to the natural order of things. Last year, a group tried to burn down the school. Year before that, someone poisoned one of our wells. But you survived it all." Goldman observed, "By standing together, by refusing to let fear divide us, by remembering that we're stronger united than separated." Thomas paused at the cemetery on the hill, where markers bore names in English, Spanish, Chinese characters, and Apache symbols. "We've buried our dead together too. Shared grief binds as strongly as shared joy." They returned to the house as darkness fell, and Goldman was welcomed into the warmth and chaos of the Garrett home. Over dinner, a meal that naturally included dishes from multiple traditions, the journalist peppered them with questions. "Mrs. Garrett, did you imagine when you opened your door to a freezing stranger that it would lead to all this?" Mary smiled, ladling more stew into his bowl. "I thought only of the storm that night, but my grandmother used to say that kindness is like water. It finds its way into cracks we don't even know exist, and eventually, it can split the hardest stone." "And you, Miss Sarah," Goldman turned to her. "You've educated hundreds of children, created textbooks that are now used in schools across the territory. Any regrets about the path your life has taken?" Sarah fixed him with her penetrating stare. "Regrets are for people who had better choices. We made the best of what was given us. The question is not whether I regret, but whether the world has learned from what we've shown is possible." After dinner, Thomas took Goldman to the town hall, a modest building that served as meeting place, courthouse, and social center. The walls were covered with photographs, newspaper clippings, and children's drawings depicting the community's history. "This is my favorite," Thomas said, pointing to a framed piece of paper, yellowed with age. It was a letter from President Cleveland, acknowledging their community as an example of American ideals in practice. Though honestly, we didn't do it for recognition. We did it because it was the only way we could see to live with integrity. Goldman studied the exhibits carefully, taking notes. "Mr. Garrett, there are those who say your community is an aberration, that it only works because of unique circumstances that can't be replicated. What do you say to them? Thomas considered the question, one he'd been asked many times before. I say that every place has unique circumstances, but the principles, treating people with dignity, working together despite differences, choosing hope over fear, those can work anywhere. We're not special. We just decided to try. But it started with you. Goldman pressed your choice that night to seek shelter, to accept help from those you'd been taught to fear. It started before me, Thomas corrected. It started with Mary and Sarah's parents, who loved across tribal lines, with their mother, who survived massacre and still chose to raise her daughters with open hearts, with every person who came to this valley carrying hurt but willing to try again. I was just one link in a chain. They were interrupted by the sound of music. The weekly dance had begun in the town hall's main room, another tradition that had evolved over the years. Thomas and Goldman joined the crowd, watching as couples swirled across the floor. Apache drums mixed with Irish fiddles, Mexican guitars, and a piano that Chen Wei's eldest had learned to play. The dancing itself was a fusion of traditions that would have horrified purists, but worked somehow, like everything else in their community. Your son, Goldman noticed. He's dancing with the Chen girl. They've been sweet on each other since they were children, Thomas confirmed. Another wedding coming soon. I expect another blending of families and traditions. As the evening wound down, Thomas found himself once again at his favorite spot, the porch of his home, looking out over the valley. But now Goldman sat beside him, and Mary and Sarah had joined them, along with James and the other children. One last question, Goldman said. If you could go back to that night, knowing everything that would come after, the struggles, the pain, the times you nearly lost everything, would you still knock on that door? Thomas looked at Mary, at their children, at Sarah, who'd become the sister he'd never had, at the lights of the town below, where hundreds of people had found a different way to live. Every single time, he said without hesitation, that storm brought me to my real life. Before that, I was just existing. The storm brought all of us to our real lives, Mary added. It showed us that the divisions we're taught are real only if we accept them, that people are just people, all needing the same things, shelter from storms, food for their children, hope for tomorrow. Sarah, ever practical, stood and began gathering empty cups, but she paused at the door to add, "Tell your readers this, Mr. Goldman. We're not perfect here. We argue, we struggle, we sometimes fail, but we get up the next day and try again, together. That's all. That's everything." Later, as Goldman prepared for sleep in the guest room, Thomas took one last walk through his town. He stopped at the school, where through the window he could see the night class, adults learning to read, taught by one of Sarah's former students. He passed the clinic where Mary trained midwives in both traditional and modern methods. He nodded to the night watchman, one of Jose's sons, keeping the community safe. At the original spot where Mary and Sarah's teepee had stood, there was now a small monument, the inscription, in 4 languages. Read on this spot, "Humanity triumphed over fear. May all who pass remember we are stronger together than alone." Thomas touched the stone, remembering that terrified young man who'd stumbled out of a blizzard into a new world. A virgin cowboy took shelter with 2 Apache sisters, he murmured to himself. And what happened changed him forever. But it had changed more than just him. It had changed everyone who'd chosen to build something new instead of clinging to something old. It had proven that America's promise, a place where all people could pursue happiness together, wasn't just words on paper, but something that could be lived, breath by breath, day by day, choice by choice. The snow continued to fall, gentle now, covering the valley in a blanket of white that made everything look new and possible. Somewhere in town, a baby cried and was soothed. Somewhere, an old man told stories to children who would carry them forward. Somewhere, Former strangers shared a meal and became family. And Thomas Garrett, no longer young, no longer alone, no longer afraid, walked home through the snow to the warmth and light that waited for him, the same warmth and light that had saved him all those years ago and continued to save him, and all of them, every single day. The story of the Virgin Cowboy and the Apache sisters had become legend, told and retold across the West. But here, in this valley, it was simply life proof that even in the harshest land, under the most difficult circumstances, love and community could take root and flourish. Proof that sometimes, when we open our doors to strangers in storms, we discover they're not strangers at all, but family we haven't met yet. And that truth, Thomas knew as he climbed his porch steps and went inside to join his loved ones, was worth more than all the gold in the mountains, all the cattle on the range, all the promises of an easier, lonelier life. It was worth everything. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'm curious to know where in the world you're tuning in from as you hear this tale of the Old West. Please take a moment to comment below and let me know your location. It's always amazing to see how these stories reach across the globe. If you enjoyed this journey with Thomas, Mary, and Sarah, don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more authentic tales of courage, love, and survival from America's frontier. I'd love to hear your thoughts about this story in the comments. What touched you most? What lessons do you think we can still learn from these characters today? Share your reflections below.